That night, I came home completely drenched, rain dripping from my jacket, and my shoes squelching with every step I took through the hallway. I had been working late again, buried under project deadlines, barely realizing it had gotten dark outside. But when I opened the door, I stopped in my tracks. There she was, standing in the dim light of the porch, her arms tightly crossed, her hair wet from the rain, as if she'd been waiting there for a while. "Sorry for showing up like this," she murmured, her eyes lowered, looking unusually unsure. "My heater broke, and it's just unbearable there tonight." Her voice was small, almost defeated. I just stared at her for a moment. The storm raged outside, but here she was, standing vulnerable and alone. This wasn't the confident, calm woman I knew. Her husband, my closest friend, had been away for months on a work assignment. During that time, I'd seen her occasionally, exchanged casual chats, and helped her when needed. But tonight, something felt different, unsettling.
"Come in,"
I finally said, stepping aside to let her in. She entered the warmth of my apartment, shivering a little as she hung her coat by the door. The silence between us felt heavy, filled with unspoken words that neither of us dared to address. I moved to the kitchen to make some tea, anything to break the tension. "You didn't have to come all the way out here in this weather," I called out, trying to sound casual. "I could have come to check on the heater." She let out a soft, nervous laugh. "It's not just that. I couldn't stand being there tonight," she said, her voice faltering. "It's too quiet, too empty." She paused, as if regretting her words, then gave a faint smile, quickly covering up the sadness in her voice. I glanced at her, catching the sorrow she was trying to hide. It was a look I hadn't seen before: exhaustion, loneliness, and something else I couldn't quite name. In all these years, I had only thought of her as my friend's wife, nothing more.
But now,
Standing here together, something shifted, something neither of us fully understood. I handed her a steaming mug of tea and motioned to the couch. We sat side by side, the warmth of the tea offering comfort against the storm that raged outside. We talked in fragments about work, the weather, the city lights flickering in the window. But even as we spoke, I could tell her mind was elsewhere, burdened by thoughts she wasn't sharing. "How's he been?" I asked cautiously, referring to her husband. She exhaled and placed her mug on the coffee table, fiddling with her sleeve. "He's fine, I think. Busy. We talk when we can, but it's mostly about work. Sometimes I wonder if he even knows how hard it's been for me here." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. I didn't know how to respond. How could I? I'd never seen her like this, so open, so vulnerable. A part of me wanted to comfort her, to say something to ease her pain, but I held back, sensing she needed this moment of honesty, of silence. Her sadness hung in the air, filling the space with an intensity one hadn't expected. After a while, she turned to me, her gaze steady, as if looking for something in my expression. Her eyes held a mix of questions, doubts, and maybe even a glimmer of hope. I felt myself leaning in, drawn closer by the weight of everything unspoken. I realized then that we had crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone. We were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't ignore. She blinked, breaking eye contact, and looked down as if regretting the moment. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, filled with raw honesty that left me speechless. The week that followed passed in a blur, but I couldn't forget that night. Her presence, her voice lingered in my mind like a faint imprint. I tried to focus on work, burying myself in projects and deadlines, but the memory kept resurfacing, tugging at the edges of my thoughts. I had hoped, maybe even assumed, that things would go back to normal after that night, that the distance between us would settle back into place. But I was wrong. One evening, she called with a simple question about a repair. Her voice was calm, just like always. But somehow, we ended up talking longer than I expected. Small, quiet exchanges that dipped just beneath the surface. I could tell loneliness was eating away at her, even if she didn't say it directly. Maybe it was doing the same to me, but I wouldn't admit it. A few days later, she asked me to meet her for coffee. It caught me off guard, but I agreed without hesitation. When I arrived at the small cafe, she was already there, sitting by the window, her gaze distant, lost in thought. She looked up when I approached, a faint, almost relieved smile on her face. "Thanks for coming," she murmured, her fingers wrapped around the cup of coffee in front of her. She seemed more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her, like someone carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. We talked about everything and nothing, just like before. But there was an underlying weight to her words, a heaviness she was trying to hide. Her fingers tapped absent-mindedly on the table, and I noticed how her gaze kept wandering, as if searching for something beyond the cafe's walls. "I feel like I'm slipping away," she confessed suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like there's this version of me he used to know, but I don't even recognize her anymore. It's like I'm just here, existing,
but not really living."
Her honesty hit me hard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to say something, anything, to ease her pain, but nothing felt right. All I could do was listen, torn between the desire to comfort her and the knowledge that we were treading dangerous ground. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine, waiting, searching. A quiet tension filled the air, an unspoken question hanging between us. And then, without thinking, I leaned in. It was brief, a fleeting moment that passed as quickly as it came, but it was enough to change everything. We pulled away from each other, a mix of shock and guilt flashing across her face, reflecting the turmoil I felt inside. She looked down, her hands trembling slightly as she set her cup on the table. "I shouldn't have. I don't know what I was thinking," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I wanted to say something to reassure her, to tell her it was okay, that I understood, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of the moment settled heavily between us, the realization that we had crossed a line we could never uncross. After a long pause, she stood, grabbed her coat, her face a mixture of regret and something else I couldn't quite identify. She glanced back at me, her expression unreadable, then turned and left the cafe, leaving me there alone with the memory of that fleeting, forbidden moment still lingering in the air. A few days after our coffee meeting, I thought maybe things would return to normal. We hadn't spoken since, and I convinced myself it was for the best, though that moment still hung between us like a shadow. But just as I was starting to get back into my routine, she called again. Her voice was tense, a little strained. "Are you home?" she asked, sounding almost apologetic.
"Yeah."
"What's wrong?" I replied, concerned. She sighed, embarrassed. "I don't even know how to explain it, but he took my keys with him this morning. He had an early meeting out of town and forgot to leave them." It took me a moment to process her words. "So, you're locked out?" I asked slowly, piecing it together. "Basically, yes," she replied, a hint of frustration slipping through. "And, of course, the spare key is with him," she added, her voice carrying the weight of a long, tiring day. "It's late. Why don't you just stay here tonight?" The words slipped out before I could stop them, but as soon as I said them, I realized it made the most sense. She didn't have anywhere else to go, and it wasn't like we hadn't shared a space before. There was a long pause on the line. "Are you sure?" "I don't want to intrude," she said, her voice hesitant. "You're not intruding," I assured her. "Come over." She arrived about half an hour later, looking a bit flustered and carrying a small overnight bag. When she stepped inside, I noticed a mix of relief and unease on her face, like she was both grateful to be somewhere familiar yet uncertain about crossing another boundary.
"Thanks for this," she said,
offering a tired smile as she hung her coat by the door. "It's just been one of those days." I made her a cup of tea, hoping the warm drink would ease the tension that still hung between us. We sat in the living room, surrounded by the quiet of the evening, the faint hum of city noise slipping through the window. She curled up on the couch, pulling a blanket over herself as we chatted. Her voice was soft, the walls she usually kept up lowering just a little. For a while, we acted like this was just another casual evening, like we'd shared countless times before. But there was a quiet tension between us now, an undercurrent that hadn't been there before. She talked about her day, about how her husband always seemed busy lately, about the little things slipping through the cracks between them. I could tell there was more she wasn't saying, that the words she spoke were only part of what she was really feeling. After a long silence, she finally met my eyes, her gaze filled with an honesty I hadn't seen before. "I feel like I'm always waiting," she admitted softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Waiting for him to come back. Waiting for things to feel like they used to." I didn't know what to say. The rawness in her words hit me harder than I was prepared for. I wanted to comfort her, to reassure her that things would get better. But I knew I couldn't give her the answer she needed.
So,
I simply listened. I let the silence stretch between us, allowing her to speak, to be heard. "Sometimes I feel like I'm invisible," she continued, her voice breaking a little, "like I'm just part of the background in his life." I wanted to say something to ease her pain, but I stayed quiet, sensing that she needed to let it all out. Her words, heavy with unspoken feelings, lingered in the space between us, too important to ignore. In that silence, I realized we had crossed a line, not with actions, but with the things we had said and felt that we'd never allowed ourselves to acknowledge before.
time passed.
And, eventually, we both felt the weight of the hour. "I'll set up the guest room for you,"
I said.
breaking the quiet. "You should try to get some rest." She nodded, her expression almost relieved as I led her to the small room at the end of the hallway. "Thank you," she said softly,
Pausing in the doorway.
her gaze lingered on me a moment longer than usual. I returned to my room, but sleep didn't come easily. The memory of her words, the look in her eyes, stayed with me, reminding me of the fragile line we were both walking. We both knew the gravity of what was happening, yet neither of us knew how to stop it. Lying there in bed, staring at the ceiling, I wondered if we had already crossed a line too far. Days passed, but the memory of that night stayed with me, haunting me during quiet moments alone. I replayed it over and over in my mind, the vulnerability in her words, the honesty in her eyes. It was getting harder to ignore what was left unsaid between us. But I kept telling myself the best thing I could do was keep my distance, avoid complicating things further. And I managed to hold on to that resolve until one evening. She called again. "I didn't know who else to call," she said,
Her voice strained.
breathless. "Can you meet me?" I hesitated, hearing the desperation in her voice. "Where are you?" I asked. "By the river," she replied quietly, "near that old bridge we used to walk by." Without thinking, I grabbed my coat and headed out. The sky was darkening, and a sharp wind sliced through the air as I made my way down the familiar path. When I arrived, I saw her standing by the railing, her figure outlined by the dim glow of the city lights reflecting off the water. As I walked toward her,
She turned.
her face a mix of relief and something I couldn't quite place. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice trembling. "I just needed someone to talk to." "What's wrong?" I asked, watching her closely. She hesitated, glancing away, her hands gripping the railing as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she whispered. "Like I'm just a shadow in his life now. Every time I try to reach him, he slips further away." Her words hit me harder than I expected, filled with rawness and exhaustion that went beyond just missing him. She was worn out, tired of being the one left behind, the one who was always expected to understand. "I'm here,"
I said.
placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a promise I wasn't sure I should make.
Yet.
In that moment, all I wanted was to give her the reassurance she so clearly needed. She turned toward me, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude, mixed with something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. The air between us felt thick, charged with unspoken tension. before she took a tentative step forward. I barely had time to process what was happening before she leaned in. Our lips met in a fleeting kiss, soft,
Quick.
and barely there, but it was enough to shatter everything. When we pulled apart, the enormity of what we had just shared hit us both like a heavy weight pressing down. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice shaky, breaking under the weight of her own emotions. I wanted to tell her it was fine, that I understood, but no words seemed right. Nothing could fix the fragile moment between us, full of regret and uncertainty. She took a hesitant step away. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice barely audible, almost drowned by the silence around us. "I know," she murmured, her gaze falling to the floor, "but I don't know how to stop." Her words lingered in my mind, each one sinking deeper, a stark realization that we were standing at a crossroads. Either we put an end to this, or it would consume everything we had, everything we cared about. We didn't speak after that.
Slowly.
We turned and walked in opposite directions, the distance between us growing with every step. I didn't look back, but the weight of her absence pressed heavily on my chest, a feeling that wouldn't fade. Weeks passed in strained silence. She didn't reach out, and I resisted the urge to contact her. Every time I thought about sending a message, I told myself that distance was the only way to prevent things from spiraling out of control. But despite my best efforts, the heaviness of it all lingered like a shadow, following me through the day. Just when I thought I might finally be moving past it, he called me. His voice, warm and familiar, brought with it a sense of normalcy that I hadn't felt in weeks. He was back in town, eager to reconnect, full of stories from his travels. We met at our usual spot, a little pub tucked away from the city's noise, with its dim lighting and the soft hum of quiet conversations. The moment he walked in, my stomach twisted into knots. All the guilt I'd been burying rushed to the surface. He sat down across from me, smiling, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. "Good to see you,
Mate," he said,
clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Feels like it's been forever."
"Yeah,"
I replied, forcing a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. We ordered drinks, and he began sharing stories from his trip, work, places he'd visited, the people he met. I nodded, laughed when needed, and tried to stay engaged. But every word felt empty. The guilt clawed at me with every passing second. After a while, he leaned back in his chair, taking a long sip of his drink before meeting my eyes. "You know," he said, "I've been so caught up in everything else that I almost forgot what it's like to just be home." His words hung in the air, deeper than I expected. I stayed quiet, unsure of where he was heading with this. "It's just," he trailed off, a flicker of something dark crossing his expression. "I feel like she's slipping away. There's this space between us that I can't explain. I keep telling myself it's just the travel, the long hours, but I'm afraid it's something more." His words hit me harder than I anticipated. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him it was all temporary, that things would be fine. But how could I? How could I lie when I was part of the very thing pulling them apart? "Have you talked to her about it?" I asked quietly,
trying to keep my voice even.
He nodded. "I tried, but it's like we're speaking different languages now. She used to tell me everything, but now it's like I don't even know her anymore," he said, pausing to run a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to get back to where we were. It's like she's moved on, but I'm stuck here." The guilt hit me like a physical blow, crushing me under the weight of my own actions. I had no advice to offer. How could I? All I could do was sit in silence as he poured his heart out about saving a relationship I had unknowingly fractured. Eventually,
He looked at me.
his expression weary. "Anyway, I'm planning something, a trip. Just the two of us," he said. "I think we need time away to reconnect, to remember why we're together in the first place." I nodded, forcing a smile. "That sounds like a good idea. I'm sure she'll appreciate it." For a moment, he looked relieved, as if my approval meant everything. In that brief instant, The guilt inside me twisted sharper than ever,
He was reaching out to me.
seeking my support, and I couldn't give him the truth. I couldn't shatter the fragile hope he still had. As the evening went on, he relaxed, recounting more stories, his laughter filling the space between us. It felt like old times, like nothing had changed. But every laugh, every shared memory, only made the guilt heavier. When the night ended, he clapped me on the shoulder.
Smiling.
"It's good to be back. I missed this."
Yeah.
I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "I missed it too." As he walked away, disappearing into the night, I stood there, weighed down by the unspoken truths between us, unsure of how to carry the burden. A few days later, just when I thought I might start to breathe easier, her name popped up on my phone. For a moment, I hesitated. We hadn't spoken since that night by the river. We had silently agreed to keep our distance. But something about the message pulled me in. "Can we meet? There's something I need to tell you." I agreed, a mix of dread and curiosity settling in my chest. We met in a quiet corner of a park on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees beginning to shed their leaves. She was already there, standing by a bench, her face unreadable. "Thanks for coming," she said softly as I approached. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though the unease was impossible to hide. She hesitated, looking away for a moment before meeting my gaze again. Her eyes filled with quiet determination. "I told him everything," she said. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me speechless. I searched her face, hoping I hadn't heard her right, but her expression said it all. "I couldn't keep living with the guilt," she whispered. "He deserves to know the truth." My mind raced, panic setting in as I imagined the fallout, anger, betrayal, the shattering of everything. "What did he say?" I asked, my voice thick with dread. She looked down, her hands clenched tightly together. "He was devastated, hurt, but he didn't leave." I stared at her, struggling to comprehend what she was saying. "He didn't leave?" She shook her head, a faint, almost bewildered smile touching her lips.
No.
He said he wanted to try to work through it, to give us a chance to fix what was broken. Her eyes met mine, a mix of sadness and hope in them. "He wants us to start over, to try again, and I think I owe it to him to try." A heavy silence fell between us as the weight of her words sank in. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, a cold fog of realization closing in around me. She had made her choice. She chose him, deciding to rebuild what we had both broken. I took a deep breath, trying to push down the ache spreading through my chest. "That's good," I said, the words feeling distant. "He deserves that." She nodded, a small, relieved expression crossing her face. "I just wanted you to know, to understand why I can't see you anymore." The weight of her words settled between us, and I forced a smile, hoping it didn't appear as hollow as it felt. "I understand. You're doing the right thing," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. We stood there, trapped in the quiet, neither of us knowing what to say next. We both knew, without saying it aloud, that this was the end. Finally, she took a small step back, offering me a faint, sad smile. "Take care of yourself," she whispered. "You too," I muttered, barely able to hear my own voice. With that, she turned and walked away, fading into the distance. I stood still, watching her disappear down the path, the sound of her footsteps slowly fading away. A long, shaky breath escaped me as the reality of her absence set in. Part of me wanted to chase after her,
To say something.
to try to change her mind, but deep down, I knew this was how it had to end. I stood there, feeling the weight of everything we had shared and everything we had lost. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the silence. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen, my heart skipping when I saw his name. The message was brief, simple, but it hit me harder than I expected. "Thank you." I stared at the words, a strange, bittersweet sense of understanding washing over me.
Somehow.
He knew, maybe not every detail, but enough to understand what had happened. Enough to forgive. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and exhaled slowly. Walking away, the mix of regret and relief settled into me. This chapter was closed, but I couldn't shake the unexpected clarity that followed. There was a strange peace in knowing it was over, even though it had been painful. Maybe, in the end, this was what we all needed, a chance to confront the truth, to let go, and to move forward, no matter how difficult it was. As I walked away from the park, the autumn leaves swirling around me, I felt a quiet gratitude, a small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd all find a way to start over.